The Cascade River flowed through the heart of the Pacific Northwest National Reserve like a vein of liquid silver, carving through towering Douglas firs and moss-covered boulders that had stood sentinel for centuries. On a brilliant July morning, when the sun filtered through the canopy and golden shafts, a young black bear named Kodiak, though the rangers didn't know his name yet, paddled through the crystalline water without a single care in the world. Kodiak was only 3 years old, a subadult male with thick, lustrous black fur and the kind of muscular build that promised he would one day be a dominant force in these woods. His eyes were bright and alert as they tracked the salmon darting between the rocks. The water was his element, his playground, his hunting ground. His mother, a formidable female called Ash by the conservation team, had taught him well. She had shown him where the fish ran thickest, where the current slowed enough to make a catch, and how to read the subtle patterns of nature that spelled survival in this vast wilderness. The young bear loved the water with a passion that seemed almost spiritual. While other bears tolerated swimming as a means to an end, Kodiak appeared to genuinely revel in it. He would dive deep, letting the cool embrace of the river wash over him and surface with his entire body glistening. Sometimes he would float on his back, his paws breaking the surface, suspended in that perfect moment between the earth and sky. Scientists who study animal behavior would later speculate that Kodiak possessed something unusual, a heightened level of consciousness, an awareness that extended beyond the typical sensory apparatus of a bear. He seemed to perceive the world not just through his eyes, ears, and nose, but through something more profound. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuroscientist who would eventually become obsessed with Kodiak's case, would later explain it to colleagues using an analogy. Consciousness is like a television channel. When you change the channel, you're still receiving information, it's just coming from a different source. We have 5 primary senses, sure, but we're only using a fraction of the sensory capabilities we're born with. This bear seemed to access something beyond that. Not mystical, but perhaps an alternative neural pathway, a different channel entirely. On that fateful morning in July, Kodiak had no way of knowing that his world was about to change forever. He had no way of knowing that 3 miles upriver, a clandestine pharmaceutical laboratory was being raided by federal rangers. The facility had been operating illegally for 2 years, conducting unauthorized experiments on animal subjects, primates, canines, and various rodents. The experiments were designed to test cognitive enhancement drugs, compounds that promised to unlock untapped potential in the human brain. The lab existed in a corrugated metal facility built into the hillside, deliberately hidden from the hiking trails and observation points. The rangers had been tracking suspicious activity for months, unusual chemical shipments, late-night truck deliveries, and reports from local hikers of strange animal cries echoing from the building. When they finally obtained the search warrant and moved in at dawn, they came prepared for resistance. What they weren't prepared for was the chaos that would ensue.
The raid began at 6:47 a.m. 20 rangers, supported by 2 wildlife veterinarians and an FBI environmental crime specialist, descended on the facility with a level of coordination and force that seemed almost military in nature. They had weapons, nets, and portable containment units for the animals inside. What they didn't have was complete knowledge of what the lab contained. The company's records were encrypted, and the lead researcher had fled 3 weeks earlier. Inside the facility, there were 17 animals being actively tested on, 3 macaque monkeys in the main laboratory, 8 laboratory rats in specialized enclosures, 2 border collies in the behavioral testing wing, and in a reinforced steel cage in the back room, a wolf that had been captured illegally from a protected pack 3 months prior. The animals were in a state of acute distress. The laboratory's life support systems, designed to maintain precise temperature and chemical levels, had begun to malfunction after a power surge at 5:30 a.m. Alarms were blaring, lights were flickering. The entire staff, all 4 employees, had abandoned their posts the moment they heard the sirens. When the rangers burst through the main entrance, they were met with a scene of controlled chaos. Animals were shrieking. Chemical fumes were thick in the air despite the building's ventilation system running at maximum capacity. And scattered throughout the facility were dozens of containers, some labeled, some not, filled with experimental compounds in various states of stability. The head ranger, a 30-year veteran named Marcus Webb, immediately ordered an evacuation protocol. The rangers secured the animals, administered tranquilizers where necessary, and began documenting the laboratory's contents. What they found was horrifying. Records of failed experiments, animals that had died in distress, and protocols for compounds that made even the experienced veterinarians' faces pale. But in the rush to secure the cages, to restore the air filtration systems, and to document evidence for prosecution, someone made a catastrophic mistake. One of the newer rangers, a trainee named Derek Hicks, was hastily moving containers of volatile compound from the north wall, chemical residue from the failed experiments. The compound had been deemed too unstable to leave behind, and the plan was to transport it to an EPA containment facility 30 miles away. Derek was young, eager, and tired. He'd been awake since 3 a.m. He was moving fast, following the chain of command, trying to do everything right. When he picked up the large stainless steel container, marked only with a faded red warning label, he didn't notice that it was already beginning to leak from a microscopic crack in its base. He didn't notice the hissing sound. He didn't notice that the concrete beneath it was already starting to discolor. He was carrying it toward the back entrance when Marcus Webb called out an order to redirect the container toward the front for better loading access. Derek pivoted quickly, and the container bumped against the edge of a metal desk. The crack widened. A small stream of viscous chemical began to pour onto the floor. Derek didn't notice. The rangers were too focused on the animals, on the documentation, on the magnitude of the illegal operation they'd uncovered. The chemical pooled on the floor, mixed with water from the decontamination station, and created a toxic mixture that began to evaporate. A volatile compound composed of experimental nootropic agents, sodium hydroxide, and trace elements that had been added to the experiment batch without proper documentation. At 7:23 a.m., still focused on the task at hand, Derek carried the container toward the back exit that led directly to the river. He was planning to set it down on the loading dock and fetch a secondary containment unit. He did set it down, but he didn't wait for the containment. The liquid had already begun to pour through the gap in the door and down the embankment. The river received the mixture in a concentrated stream. The chemicals immediately began to interact with the water's natural pH balance, creating a thermal reaction that warmed the liquid by 15 degrees. The mixture dispersed downstream in a plume of cloudy, iridescent fluid that caught the morning sunlight like an oil slick. At that exact moment, exactly 53 meters downstream, Kodiak was diving for salmon.
The pain was immediate and all-consuming. It was like immersing his entire face in liquid fire. Kodiak's instinct was pure animal panic. He thrashed violently, his body convulsing as the chemical mixture contacted his sensitive skin, his nasal passages, his eyes. The compounds were designed to enhance neuroplasticity. They were supposed to cross the blood-brain barrier and stimulate unused neural pathways. But on exposed skin and delicate membranes, they had a completely different effect. The chemical burned away the protective tear film on his eyes. It seared the tissue of his corneas. It caused his hair to stand on end as it stripped the protective oils from his fur, and then it began to burn the skin beneath. Kodiak screamed, a primal, anguished sound that echoed through the forest and caused every bird within a mile to take flight. His mother, Ash, who had been fishing 20 meters downstream, immediately recognized the distress call of her cub. She abandoned her kill and charged toward the sound, her massive frame moving with surprising speed despite her weight. She found Kodiak thrashing in the water, his head above the surface but his eyes squeezed shut, his paws clawing at his face. Blood mixed with the river water. The chemical smell was acrid and wrong. nothing like anything she'd encountered in her 10 years in these woods. Ash did what mothers do. She rushed into the water, grabbed her cub by the fur on his neck, and hauled them out with strength born of desperation. Kodiak was still thrashing, still screaming, still clawing at his face. The pain was beyond anything the young bear had ever experienced. It was absolute and total. Ash dragged him to the bank and immediately began to lick at his face, trying to clean the wound the way she'd cleaned his injury since he was a cub. But this was different. Whatever was burning him was still active, still working on the exposed tissue. After a few moments, Ash seemed to understand that her instinctive response wasn't helping. She did the only thing she could do. She stayed with him. She lay down beside him on the soft moss and pressed her body against his, a gesture of protection and comfort, and waited for the burning to stop. The pain did eventually subside, though it took hours. By noon, Kodiak's screaming had reduced to whimpers. By evening, he lay still beside his mother, trembling, his eyes swollen shut. Upstream, Marcus Webb received a phone call on his sat phone. It was Derek. He'd realized, about 20 minutes after leaving the dock, that one of the containers had been leaking. Marcus's response was immediate and professional. He ordered an evacuation of the area, closed the access points to the river, and contacted the EPA emergency response team. By the time the federal agents realized there might be wildlife affected by the chemical spill, the damage had already been done.
That night, 2 park rangers on routine patrol found Kodiak and Ash on the riverbank. The young bear was barely breathing, his entire face swollen and oozing. His eyes appeared to be completely sealed shut, not just closed, but fused by the damage to the surrounding tissue. Even the rangers' experienced eyes, used to the harsh realities of wildlife management, were moved by the sight. "He's not going to make it," one of them, a man named Thomas, said quietly. "We should put him down. It's the humane thing to do." But Ash stood between them and her cub, her ears back, her posture aggressive. She wasn't going to allow them to come near. The rangers backed away, radioed in their observations, and received instruction from the park director to monitor the situation, but not to intervene unless the bear appeared to be suffering acutely. The rangers left. The night fell completely dark, and Kodiak, lying on the mossy bank of the river with his mother's warm body pressed against us, began a process of healing that should have been impossible. Something extraordinary was happening inside the young bear's body. The chemical compound that had burned his eyes had, in its molecular cascade through his nervous system, had triggered something unexpected. The nootropic agents had breached the blood-brain barrier. They had reached the brain tissue itself, but instead of causing the kind of enhancement they were designed for in humans, they had activated alternative neural pathways, latent connections that had existed in Kodiak's brain but had never been utilized. Evolution, it seems, had given bears, and all mammals, more sensory potential than most of them would ever need to access. The primary senses worked well enough, but tucked away in the cerebral tissue were connections to other forms of perception: proprioception, electromagnetic sensitivity, thermal imaging, sonar-like echolocation, and most crucially, a form of spatial awareness so advanced that it made traditional vision seem almost primitive by comparison. The chemical compound in its destructive action on Kodiak's eyes had, in its molecular cascade through his nervous system, had triggered something unexpected. The nootropic agents had breached the blood-brain barrier. They had reached the brain tissue itself, but instead of causing the kind of enhancement they were designed for in humans, they had activated alternative neural pathways, latent connections that had existed in Kodiak's brain but had never been utilized. Evolution, it seems, had given bears, and all mammals, more sensory potential than most of them would ever need to access. The primary senses worked well enough, but tucked away in the cerebral tissue were connections to other forms of perception: proprioception, electromagnetic sensitivity, thermal imaging, sonar-like echolocation, and most crucially, a form of spatial awareness so advanced that it made traditional vision seem almost primitive by comparison. The chemical compound, in its destructive action on Kodiak's eyes, had accidentally activated these dormant pathways in his brain. As the inflammation receded over the following days, as his body healed from the external chemical burns, something fundamental had shifted in his consciousness. On the second morning, Kodiak stood up. His eyes were still swollen shut, still bandaged by the dried scar tissue, but he stood without assistance. He walked in a perfect circle, touching his nose to the moss. His mother watched, cautious and uncertain. By the third day, Kodiak was moving around the forest with an uncanny certainty. He was navigating perfectly through the dense undergrowth. He was avoiding obstacles that he couldn't possibly see. He caught his first post-incident meal, 3 trout from a pool upstream, with remarkable accuracy, striking at the exact moment the fish would enter his strike zone. The 2 rangers who had monitored him from a distance were utterly baffled. When they reported back to the park director, their accounts were met with skepticism. Animals don't recover from complete blindness. It wasn't possible. But Kodiak had done something more remarkable than recover sight. He had learned to see without his eyes.
5 months passed. The seasons shifted from summer to autumn, and the forest prepared itself for winter. Kodiak, now nearly 4 years old and standing over 6 feet when he rose on his hind legs, had become something entirely unprecedented in the annals of wildlife science. He was thriving. Not only thriving, he was becoming dominant. Park rangers observed him catching more fish than any other bear in the territory. They watched as he competed with 3 other bears for a particularly rich salmon run and came away victorious every single time, despite the other bears having fully functional eyesight. They documented him traveling through the densest parts of the forest at full speed, never stumbling, never hesitating, moving with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. More disturbing to the wildlife management team were the reports from the predator community. Wolves in particular seemed to be avoiding the area where Kodiak spent most of his time. Rangers found evidence of kill sites where wolves had begun their attack on other game animals only to abandon them mid-feast and flee. The tracks and signs suggested they had been frightened away by something, but there was never any evidence of a confrontation. Then came the day when a pack of 5 wolves actually encountered Kodiak directly. Dr. Sarah Chen, the neuroscientist who would later become obsessed with Kodiak's case, was conducting a fellowship at the research facility attached to the national park. She was studying predator-prey dynamics using remote camera systems when her team captured footage of the encounter. They reviewed the tapes at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday when they saw it. A massive black bear moving through a moonlit clearing, moving with perfect grace despite the darkness. A pack of 5 gray wolves emerged from the tree line, clearly intending to challenge the bear for a partially consumed elk carcass that lay between them. What happened next would be analyzed frame by wildlife experts, debated in academic journals, and eventually shown in universities across the country as evidence that animal intelligence and animal sensory perception was far more sophisticated than mainstream science had previously acknowledged. The bear didn't attack. He didn't even charge. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his head angled in a posture that suggested, impossible though it seemed, that he was listening. His ears, which lacked eyelids and thus moved with perfect freedom, rotated slightly. The camera's audio captured something extraordinary, a series of low-frequency vocalizations emanating from Kodiak's body, sounds too deep for human ears to fully process at the normal playback speed, but perfectly audible when the recording was slowed down. The wolves' behavior changed instantly. From a confident pack moving toward potential prey, they became hesitant and confused.
Their body language shifted from aggression to uncertainty. They began to back away, their eyes locked on the bear, their movements jerky and unpredictable. Within 30 seconds, they had turned completely and retreated into the forest at a full run. Dr. Chen watched the footage again and again. She consulted with colleagues. She reviewed everything known about bear vocalizations, wolf behavior, and interspecies communication. The only conclusion she could draw was that the bear had somehow conveyed a message so convincing, so primal, that it had overridden the wolf's natural confidence and territorial drive. He didn't attack them with violence, she explained to her research team. He communicated something else. I don't know what. Fear, maybe, or something we don't have a framework for understanding, but whatever it was effective. By late autumn, word had spread through certain circles that there was an extraordinary bear in the Cascade Reserve. The animal had become something of a legend among the rangers, though they kept the details relatively quiet. They knew what kind of attention a bear like that would attract. They were right to be worried. In a small town called Millbrook, 30 miles from the reserve, a man named Victor Carlisle ran a wildlife trafficking operation disguised as a hunting guide service. Victor was in his late 50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his whole life outdoors. But there was something cold and calculating in his pale blue eyes. He had connections to black market dealers who supplied exotic animal parts to collectors worldwide: tiger pelts, rhino horns, bear bile for use in traditional medicine, and hides from endangered species that commanded five-figure prices from collectors. Victor's network of informants, including a disgruntled park ranger with gambling debts, had informed him that there was a massive black bear with an unusual temperament in the Cascade Reserve. The description was vague, but it was enough to pique Victor's interest. A truly massive bear, something that could be characterized as rare or unique, could fetch an enormous price. Victor had 3 men who worked for him regularly on the more lucrative jobs. There was Jack Murdoch, a former military sniper with a drinking problem and a complete lack of conscience. There was Kyle Simmons, a poacher from the local area who'd grown up hunting and had a genuine skill when it came to tracking animals through difficult terrain. And there was Tommy Chen, who handled logistics and managed the various networks of buyers and handlers. On a cold November morning, with the first light snow beginning to fall from gray clouds, Victor called a meeting in the garage behind his house. He spread out detailed maps of the reserve and pointed to the area where Kodiak had been most frequently spotted. "Here's the plan," Victor said, his voice calm and measured. "We go in at night. We set a perimeter of traps, good ones, the kind that'll hold him without killing him. We use sedative darts to put him down once he's caught. We load him into the containment unit. We're out before dawn, in and out, clean and simple." "What's the take?" Axe asked. He was cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. 50,000, maybe more, depending on which buyer takes him. Could be as high as 75 if the right collector wants him. Kyle leaned back in his chair. "That bear's supposed to be huge, 600 pounds easy. You're talking about a sedative dose that could kill him if it's not perfect. That's why we're paying Kyle 20,000 just to handle the capture. You are the best tracker we have. You find him. You confirm he's the one. You help us with the traps." Money was mentioned. Professional courtesy was extended. No one seemed particularly troubled by the fact that they were discussing the capture and trafficking of a protected species from a federal wildlife reserve, a crime that carried federal prison time. 3 days later, as the first real snow of the season began to fall, they were ready to move.
Kyle Simmons was, in fact, an exceptionally good tracker. He read the forest the way a scholar reads a book, understanding its language of broken twigs, disturbed soil, and trail markings. He found evidence of Kodiak within 2 hours of entering the reserve: scratch marks on a tree where the bear had marked territory, scat that was still fresh, and massive paw prints in the snow that suggested an animal significantly larger than average. "He's here," Kyle said into his radio, moving northeast from the lower meadow. He's probably heading toward the deep woods to den up for the season. We need to move fast. Victor and his men began laying their traps. These weren't simple snares or rope traps. These were sophisticated steel devices that could restrain a bear indefinitely. They were commercial equipment, the kind used in legitimate wildlife management operations, but in the hands of poachers, they were tools of capture and control. They laid 5 traps in strategic locations based on Kyle's analysis of Kodiak's movement patterns. Each trap was baited with a mixture of fish, honey, and raw meat that was nearly irresistible to a bear. Each trap was connected via GPS to a portable receiver that would alert them the moment one was sprung. Then they settled down in a concealed camp to wait. The next morning, at 6:47 a.m., exactly 8 months to the moment when the chemical had been spilled into the river, Kyle's receiver beeped. A trap had been sprung. The men gathered their equipment and moved quickly toward the signal. When they reached the trap, they found something unexpected. It was empty. The bait was gone. The trap had been deliberately avoided. The snare mechanism had been triggered, but by something on the ground, not by a creature stepping into the trap's firing range. "He's smart," Kyle said with something approaching respect. "He knows what a trap is." Over the next 12 hours, all 5 traps were sprung in exactly the same manner. Each one carefully activated from a distance, each one left empty of any captive. The bait disappeared, presumably consumed by Kodiak, but the bear refused to fall for the actual mechanism. Victor was beginning to realize that his informant's description of unusual and unique might mean something more than just physical size. He said, "Set more traps, bigger ones, different configurations. This bear is smart, but he's still just an animal." By day 3, they had set 17 traps across a 2-mile radius. By day 4, all 17 had been triggered and left empty. By day 5, they had begun to suspect that Kodiak wasn't just avoiding the traps, he was actively defeating them. Victor's men found evidence that the bear had learned the exact mechanism of each trap type and had developed strategies to trigger them safely. "That's not possible," Kyle said, staring at the 5th modified trap configuration, examining how it had been neutralized. "Bears don't learn like this. They follow patterns, yes, but this is problem-solving on a level that's almost intelligent." Victor made a decision. "We shift to direct capture. We find him, we dart him, we load him. End of story. Jack, I want you on Overwatch. Rifle scope, tranquilizer darts modified for your weapon. Tommy, get the containment unit closer to our position." What Victor didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that Kodiak had already detected them. Not through sight, but through the sophisticated sensory awareness that the chemical had activated. He could perceive the thermal signatures of their bodies at a distance of over a kilometer. He could hear their heartbeats through the ground vibrations of their footsteps. He could sense the electromagnetic fields generated by their electronic equipment. And he was tracking them with the same methodical intelligence with which they were tracking him. On the 6th day of the hunt, as snow continued to fall and the temperature dropped to well below freezing, Kodiak made a choice that would determine whether this story ended as tragedy or triumph. Jack Murdoch was positioned on a ridge overlooking a clearing where Kyle had predicted Kodiak would appear. Jack was an excellent marksman. His military training had given him the ability to make precise shots under difficult conditions. He had a tranquilizer rifle with a scope that had thermal imaging capability, and he was confident in his ability to execute the plan. What he didn't know was that Kodiak could see him. Not with eyes, but with a form of thermal perception that made his position glow like a beacon in Kodiak's enhanced awareness. The bear emerged from the forest at 2:47 p.m., moving with that characteristic grace and certainty that would have seemed impossible for a blind animal.
He was massive, nearly 7 feet tall when he stood on his hind legs, with thick, lustrous black fur and a presence that seemed to command the very air around him. To anyone watching, he appeared to be looking directly at them, despite his sealed, scarred eyes. Kyle, positioned 300 meters away, spoke into his radio. "He's in position. Jack, you've got your shot." Jack took aim. He was calm and professional, his breathing steady, his finger on the trigger. The thermal scope showed the bear's massive body, perfectly framed in the reticle. Jack had taken hundreds of shots before, on military assignments, in professional competitions, on hunts that had fed his soul with the rush of the predator. This was just another shot. Except it wasn't. In the exact moment before Jack's finger completed the trigger squeeze, Kodiak moved. He didn't run or charge. He simply shifted his position by 2 meters with a movement so subtle and so precisely timed that it would seem impossible to anyone reviewing the footage later. The tranquilizer dart that Jack had fired with perfect accuracy struck empty air, passing through the space where the bear had been a millisecond before. Jack's second shot was already chambered and fired within seconds. Kodiak moved again, this time without any apparent visual cue, sidestepping the dart with a grace that would have seemed choreographed if it weren't happening in real time. On the third shot, something extraordinary happened. Instead of evading, Kodiak suddenly accelerated directly toward the ridge where Jack was positioned. He ran at full speed across the snow-covered clearing, his massive frame moving with a power that seemed to defy physics. Behind him, Kyle was shouting into his radio, and Victor's voice was crackling back with confused, angry questions. Jack fired one more tranquilizer dart, but this time in desperation rather than precision. It flew wild. He scrambled to eject the dart magazine and reload with live ammunition, but he had hesitated too long. Kodiak had made the ridge in less than 30 seconds, a distance that would have taken a human minutes. What happened next would be debated for years to come. Kodiak emerged from the tree line directly in front of Jack's position. For a moment, just a single moment, they were face to face. Jack was on his feet now, rifle in hand, his hand moving toward his pistol. He was staring directly into what had once been Kodiak's eyes, those sealed, scarred sockets that should have contained blindness. But there was something in the bear's posture, in the absolute certainty of its movements, in the way its head was angled, something that conveyed an impossible intelligence. Kodiak made a sound. It was the same low-frequency vocalization that had terrified the wolves, but there was something more to it this time. It wasn't a threat. It was something else. It was almost like communication. Almost like understanding. For reasons he would never be able to fully articulate, Jack Murdoch lowered his rifle. His hands were shaking. His professional composure, honed by military training and hardened by violence, cracked completely. He stepped backward, one step, then another. He didn't run, but he was retreating, moving away from the bear with the deliberate movements of someone who understood that they had just made a choice between two possible outcomes of this moment. Kodiak stood perfectly still. His head was angled as if he was watching Jack's departure. Then, without any apparent aggression or warning, he turned and vanished back into the forest with the same silent grace with which he'd appeared. Jack descended from the ridge on shaking legs. When he reached Kyle and the others, his face was pale despite the cold. "We're done," he said quietly. "I don't know what that is, but it's not an animal we're equipped to handle. It knows what we're doing. It understands us." Victor wanted to push forward, but when he saw the look on Jack's face, he understood that the operation had fundamentally changed. Something had broken in the professional facade of his team. That evening, as they packed up their equipment and prepared to leave the reserve, Victor made a call to his buyer in Portland. "The job's not happening," he said simply. "The animal is too risky. We're standing down." By the next morning, all the poachers had left the reserve. What Victor Carlisle and his team didn't know was that Park Ranger Sarah Chen, not the same Sarah Chen who was a neuroscientist at the research facility, but one of the regular park staff who shared a name, had photographed the entire encounter from a concealed position about 300 meters away. She'd been doing research on predator presence in the western sector of the park when she detected the unusual activity. Her camera, equipped with a telephoto lens and mounted on a stable tripod, had captured every moment of the standoff on a sequence of high-resolution digital photographs. By evening, those photographs were on the desk of Dr. Sharon Mitchell, the park director. Within 2 days, they were being examined by wildlife specialists from 5 different institutions. Within a week, they had been presented to the board of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The images were extraordinary. They showed a massive bear, far larger than typical for the region, approaching a human armed with a rifle. They showed the moment of absolute stillness where animal and human faced each other, and they showed, in stunning clarity, the bear's scarred, sealed eyes, evidence of catastrophic damage to the ocular tissue. The question became impossible to ignore. How was this animal functioning? Federal investigators began their inquiry into the illegal laboratory. They cross-referenced the chemical spill incident with the timeline of Kodiak's transformation. They contacted Dr. Sarah Chen at the research facility, and she provided her own footage of the bear's supernatural movements and vocalizations. Within weeks, her research had become the official focus of a joint investigation by the EPA, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Institutes of Health. News outlets picked up the story. What had started as an obscure wildlife incident became a national phenomenon. Documentaries were planned. Academic conferences were scheduled. Scientists from around the world contacted the park with offers to study the animal. But Kodiak himself remained in the forest, exactly where he'd always been. By the spring of the following year, a new equilibrium had been established in the Cascade Reserve. Kodiak had successfully survived his first full winter in his transformed state. He had denned in a cave system deep in the protected forest, where he had survived on his own resources and the accumulated fat reserves built up during the previous summer and fall. When he emerged in early April, his coat was thick and lustrous, his weight had returned to full mass, and his movements had become, if anything, even more refined and precise. Park rangers continued their monitoring, but they had been given explicit instructions not to interfere. In fact, new management protocols were established specifically to protect Kodiak and ensure that his presence didn't attract harmful attention. Barriers were erected to limit human access to the areas where he spent most of his time. Anti-poaching patrols were increased, and a research station was established with official protocols for studying the animal while maintaining its safety and well-being. Dr. Sarah Chen published her preliminary findings in the Journal of Neuroscience. Her paper, titled Extraordinary Neuroplasticity in the Cerebral Cortex of a Post-Traumatic Animal Subject, presented evidence that suggested consciousness itself operated on multiple channels, and that sufficiently powerful trauma could trigger the activation of latent neural pathways in mammals. The bear in question, she wrote, appears to have developed a form of spatial awareness and sensory integration that we might describe as vision without sight. Through a combination of echolocation, electromagnetic sensitivity, thermal perception, and proprioceptive integration, this individual has achieved a level of perceptual completeness that rivals and in some cases exceeds that of sighted animals. The paper sparked intense debate in the scientific community. Some researchers remained skeptical, arguing that the evidence was anecdotal and that alternative explanations existed. Others were fascinated, wondering if the implications extended beyond this single animal. Could similar pathways be activated in other species?
Could the findings eventually have applications in helping blind humans develop enhanced alternative sensory abilities? But in the Cascade Reserve itself, the focus remained on the bear's well-being and the broader ecosystem. Kodiak's presence had stabilized local predator-prey dynamics. The wolves, having learned to respect the blind bear's mysterious power, had begun to prey more selectively and sustainably. The elk population, no longer subjected to the unchecked predation that had begun after the wolves' initial fear response, had stabilized at a healthier level. And Kodiak himself had assumed a role as an apex predator, not through dominance displays in conflict, but through an almost philosophical presence that seemed to establish a natural order. His mother, Ash, remained alive through her 12th year, an unusually long lifespan for a wild bear. Rangers often observed her near Kodiak, moving in parallel paths through the forest. Whatever had happened to her cub had not been lost on her. She had adapted her own hunting patterns and movements to accommodate his presence, something that might have been simple maternal instinct or might have been something deeper.
3 years after the chemical spill, when Kodiak was 7 years old and fully established as a dominant figure in the Cascade ecosystem, another threat emerged. The federal government announced a development proposal that would log portions of the northern sector of the reserve. Ostensibly, it was managed logging, removal of dead trees and fire-damaged timber to reduce forest fire risk. But environmental groups and local activists recognized it for what it really was: the beginning of a land grab that would result in the reserve losing significant acreage to timber harvesting. The announcement sparked controversy. Environmental lawyers filed injunctions, public hearings were scheduled, congressmen took sides based on political pressure from both conservation groups and timber companies. And then on a clear July morning exactly 5 years after the chemical spill, something happened that would ultimately determine the outcome of the battle. Kodiak emerged from the deep forest and appeared at the boundary of the proposed logging zone. He stood on a ridge overlooking an area where surveying equipment had been set up. The 6 surveyors and engineers working in the area became immediately alert to the presence of an unusually large bear. What happened next was captured on multiple cameras, both official survey cameras and news cameras from the environmental group that had set up observation posts to document the logging operation's impact on wildlife. Kodiak stood on the ridge for exactly 13 minutes. He didn't attack or approach the human workers. He simply stood there, his massive frame silhouetted against the morning sky, his presence somehow conveying an unmistakable message. This land belongs to more than just humans. The footage went viral within hours. News networks showed the image of the massive blind bear standing sentinel over the proposed logging zone. Environmental activists use it in their campaign materials. Social media exploded with the story of Kodiak, the blind bear that had learned to see through some force science couldn't fully explain, now standing as a guardian of the forest that had raised him. The public response was overwhelming. Within 2 weeks, over 500,000 people had signed a petition opposing the logging operation. Congressional offices were flooded with letters and calls. The political calculus shifted fundamentally. What had been a relatively straightforward resource extraction decision became a flashpoint in the national conversation about environmental protection, animal consciousness, and humanity's relationship with the natural world. The Department of Interior made an announcement. The logging operation would be indefinitely postponed pending further study of the ecosystem and its unique wildlife. The protection of Kodiak's habitat took precedence. The timber companies appealed, hired lawyers, and filed their own countersuits. But the momentum was with the conservationists now. Environmental groups rallied behind the image of the blind bear. Universities offered research opportunities. The Cascade Reserve became one of the most protected parcels of federal land in the country. Dr. Sarah Chan was invited to testify before Congress.
She presented her research, explained the implications of Kodiak's neuroplasticity, and advocated for expanded protection of the reserve and similar ecosystems. When one congresswoman asked her, "Do you believe this bear is intelligent?" Dr. Chen paused thoughtfully. She said, "I believe," she said carefully, "that intelligent is a word we use to describe a particular kind of information processing and problem-solving capability. By that definition, this bear demonstrates remarkable intelligence. But I also believe we're only beginning to understand what consciousness actually is. This bear might be operating on a form of awareness that our current vocabulary doesn't adequately describe. He's intelligent, yes, but he might be something more than that as well."
2 years after Kodiak's stand on the ridge, when he was 9 years old and the reserve had settled into its new protected status, an unexpected tragedy occurred. A hiker named Michael Torres, a 43-year-old software engineer from Seattle who had come to the reserve to disconnect from his high-pressure job, became lost. He had ignored ranger warnings about staying on marked trails and had ventured into the deep forest seeking solitude. By evening, he was hopelessly disoriented, his phone was dead, and he was beginning to panic. The temperature dropped to near freezing that night. Michael huddled against a massive tree, wearing only a light jacket that provided inadequate protection. He was in danger of hypothermia. His situation was becoming critical. What he didn't know was that he had ventured into Kodiak's territory, into the deep forest where the bear spent his nights. Around 11 p.m., as Michael was beginning to lose consciousness from the cold, Kodiak found him. The bear's thermal perception would have detected the human's body warmth like a beacon. His echolocation would have painted a complete picture of the man's location and condition. His electromagnetic sensitivity would have registered the fading neural activity of a brain succumbing to hypothermia. For a long moment, Kodiak simply stood there in the darkness, perceiving this human presence in perfect detail despite his sealed, blind eyes. Michael, barely conscious, looked up and saw the massive shadow of the bear's head above him. His mind, fogged by cold and fear, registered only that a wild animal was about to end his life. But Kodiak did something extraordinary. The bear laid down beside Michael. He wrapped his massive body around the human, a living furnace of fur and muscle and body heat. Throughout the night, as the temperature plummeted to near freezing, Kodiak remained motionless beside the lost hiker, sharing his warmth, keeping Michael alive through the long, dark hours. When dawn broke, park rangers found them. Michael Torres, alive but deeply hyperthermic, and Kodiak, still positioned beside him, his eyes closed in what might have been sleep or might have been meditation. The bear stood when the rangers approached, and he walked away into the forest with that characteristic grace and certainty, leaving no aggression, no territorial display, just a simple departure. Michael survived. He spent 2 days in the reserve's medical facility being treated for severe hyperthermia, but he recovered completely. When he was well enough to speak, his account of what had happened was detailed and consistent. He described the bear finding him, lying down beside him and keeping him warm through the night. He described feeling the bear's breathing, steady and regular, a rhythm that had seemed almost comforting in his deteriorating state. "He saved my life," Michael said simply. "I don't understand why, but there's no doubt about it. That bear saved my life." The incident spread through the news cycle with remarkable velocity. Here was not just a bear that had overcome blindness through some neurological miracle, but an animal that appeared to possess something that looked remarkably like compassion. The story of Kodiak, the blind bear who could see and now apparently could feel, became a symbol of something larger. The possibility that consciousness and compassion existed across species boundaries in ways that science had never fully appreciated. By the time Kodiak reached his 10th birthday, he had become something more than an animal.
He was a symbol. He was a teaching tool. He was evidence of possibilities that had seemed impossible. Dr. Sarah Chen had published 3 additional papers on her research into Kodiak's neuroplasticity. Universities across the country had established research programs specifically focused on understanding how trauma could activate latent neural pathways. There had been preliminary investigations into whether similar protocols might help blind humans develop enhanced alternative sensory capabilities. None of it had reached the stage of clinical application, but the research was ongoing and promising. The Cascade Reserve had become one of the most protected ecosystems in North America. Its annual budget had tripled. Its research facilities had expanded. Scientists from around the world came to study not just Kodiak, but the entire ecosystem that he had helped to establish. The wolves that had learned respect through his presence, the balanced predator-prey dynamics, the overall health and stability of the forest. Kodiak himself had settled into his role. He was no longer hunted or threatened. He roamed the forest freely, his presence both a comfort to environmental advocates and a source of ongoing scientific fascination. His mother, Ash, had died in her sleep during the previous winter, but Kodiak seemed to understand her passing. Rangers observed him spending 2 full days at the cave where she had denned, a behavior that suggested mourning or at least an awareness of her absence. He had not mated. At 10 years old, he was at the prime age for breeding, but no other bears had successfully integrated into his territory. Perhaps they sensed something unusual about him, some quality that made him an incomplete match for reproduction. Or perhaps Kodiak himself chose solitude, a price paid for the extraordinary consciousness that the chemical accident had activated. On the 10th anniversary of the chemical spill, Michael Torres returned to the reserve. He had left his job in software engineering and had become an advocate for wildlife protection. He worked with environmental organizations to promote the protection of critical habitats. He had written a book about his experience in the forest, about the night Kodiak had saved his life, about what that experience had taught him regarding the interconnectedness of all living things. He came to the reserve specifically hoping to encounter Kodiak again, though he had no way of knowing if such an encounter was possible or even wise. He was hiking in the western meadow at sunset when Kodiak emerged from the tree line. The bear stood about 50 meters away, his massive frame silhouetted against the orange and purple sky. For a moment, human and bear regarded each other across the distance. Michael didn't advance. He simply stood there, letting tears flow down his face as he recognized the animal that had saved him. Kodiak stood perfectly still, his head angled in that characteristic way, his sealed eyes directed toward Michael with an intensity that suggested genuine recognition. Then Kodiak made that low-frequency vocalization, not threatening, but almost like acknowledgement, like greeting. The sound resonated through Michael's chest, carrying within it something that felt like understanding. The bear turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the darkening shadows of the trees.
3 months after Michael's return, a new threat emerged that would test everything that Kodiak's existence had come to represent. A pharmaceutical company called Nexus Biotech, which had acquired much of the assets and remaining research data from the illegal laboratory that had caused the original chemical spill, filed a petition with the federal government requesting permission to capture Kodiak for research purposes. Their argument was sophisticated and compelling. They claimed that studying Kodiak's brain directly could yield revolutionary treatments for blindness, neurological injuries, and degenerative cognitive diseases. The bear, their official statement read, represents a unique research opportunity that could benefit millions of humans suffering from sensory disabilities. Captured humanely and maintained in a state-of-the-art research facility, this individual could provide invaluable scientific insight. The petition triggered a massive public and political backlash. Environmental organizations mobilized. Michael Torres testified before Congress again, This time, not as a subject describing his experience, but as an advocate fighting to protect the bear that had saved his life. Dr. Sarah Chen published an open letter to the scientific community arguing that capturing Kodiak would be an unforgivable betrayal of scientific ethics. "This bear," she wrote, "is not merely a research subject. He is an individual with apparent consciousness, with demonstrated problem-solving abilities, with what appears to be genuine compassion toward other beings. To capture him for research would be to reduce a sentient being to the status of an experimental animal, despite evidence that he possesses a level of awareness that might demand ethical protections similar to those we extend to humans." The debate raged for weeks. Some scientists agreed with Dr. Chen's position. Others argued that the potential benefits to humans justified the capture and study of a single animal. Legal teams on both sides prepared arguments. The case seemed set to go before the Supreme Court. But then, something unexpected happened. On a day when the federal government was preparing to issue a preliminary decision on the Nexus petition, Kodiak appeared at the boundary of the reserve. He walked directly to the main ranger station and stood outside the building for several hours. Rangers, uncertain what to do in the face of this unusual behavior, contacted Dr. Sarah Chen. She drove to the reserve and stood looking at Kodiak through the station's large windows. The bear's head was angled toward her with that characteristic intensity. His sealed eyes were directed at her with perfect certainty. "He knows," she said quietly to the rangers around her. "He understands what's happening, and he's come here to make a statement." News cameras captured footage of the massive blind bear standing outside the ranger station. The images went viral within hours. Environmental advocates used them in their media campaigns. The public response was overwhelming. Over 1 million people called or emailed their representatives in government. Over 2 million signed a petition opposing Nexus Biotech's research proposal. Within a week, the federal government announced that it would not grant permission for Kodiak's capture. More significantly, new legislation was drafted, the Cascade Bear Protection Act, which would establish strict guidelines for research on sentient wildlife and would grant Kodiak official protection under endangered species legislation, despite the fact that black bears, as a species, were not endangered. The bill passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support. The president signed it into law on a sunny October morning, exactly 10 years and 3 months after the chemical spill that had begun everything. In her signing statement, the president noted, "This law recognizes that consciousness and sentience are not limited to humanity. It establishes new standards for our relationship with the natural world, and it honors a remarkable individual, a bear that has taught us profound truths about the nature of perception, adaptability, and compassion."
5 years later, Kodiak was 15 years old. He had lived a life that spanned the incredible, from a joyful young bear swimming in rivers to a being transformed by catastrophe into something that science was still struggling to understand. His role in the world had evolved beyond what anyone could have predicted. He was not just an animal, but a symbol, a living embodiment of possibility, of the capacity for consciousness and adaptation, of the interconnectedness of all living things. Other bears in the reserve had begun to exhibit behavioral changes. Some researchers speculated that Kodiak's offspring, despite his apparent lack of breeding, might have inherited some predisposition toward the kind of neuroplasticity he had demonstrated. Others suggested that the bears were simply learning from observing his behaviors, that consciousness itself was being transmitted through observation and adaptation. Dr. Sarah Chen had founded the Institute for Alternative Consciousness Research, a facility dedicated to understanding how trauma, neuroplasticity, and consciousness interacted across species. The institute had become a leading center for neuroscience research, attracting researchers from around the world. Papers published by the institute's scientists had begun to reshape fundamental assumptions about animal cognition and sentience. Michael Torres had written 3 additional books about his experiences with Kodiak and had become a leading voice in the animal rights and environmental protection movements. He remained friends with Dr. Chen, and together they had become perhaps the two most prominent human advocates for Kodiak's protection and well-being. The Cascade Reserve itself had become a symbol of successful ecosystem protection and management. It was studied in universities. Environmental organizations pointed to it as a model for how federal lands could be protected while still allowing for research and limited human visitation. The reserve's economic value to the surrounding communities had actually increased, as ecotourism and research-related spending brought in far more revenue than timber harvesting would have generated. On a clear day in October, Kodiak was observed walking to the riverbank, the same river where he had been swimming as a young cub on that fateful day 10 years earlier. He stood at the water's edge for a long time, his massive frame still strong despite his advancing age. Rangers watching from a respectful distance through binoculars noted that he seemed to be contemplating something, his head angled in that characteristic way, his sealed eyes directed downward at the flowing water. He didn't enter the river. Instead, after several minutes, he turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the trees with that grace that had defined his post-transformation existence. But in that moment at the river's edge, something profound seemed to have occurred. Perhaps a remembrance of the bear he had been before the accident. Perhaps an acknowledgement of how far he had come. Perhaps simply the memory of joy and innocence frozen forever at the moment before everything changed. What was certain was that Kodiak's life had changed not just his own existence, but the entire trajectory of human understanding about consciousness, sentience, and our relationship with the natural world. He had proven that adaptation was possible, that consciousness was multifaceted, that compassion could cross species boundaries, and that even in catastrophe, transcendence was within reach. As news organizations reflected on the decades since the chemical spill, as scientists continued to study the implications of Kodiak's neuroplasticity, as environmental laws bearing his name protected forests across the continent, a consensus began to emerge. The bear that had learned to see without eyes had taught humanity to see itself differently. In boardrooms and laboratories, in halls of power, and in quiet forests, people and institutions began to consider the question that Kodiak's existence had forced them to confront. If consciousness could be activated through trauma and adaptation in an animal, what did that suggest about consciousness itself? What did it suggest about the untapped potential that might exist in all living things, including humanity? These questions would drive research and philosophy for decades to come. Universities would establish new departments dedicated to studying animal consciousness. New ethical frameworks would be developed for considering the rights and protections of sentient beings. And at the center of it all, in the Cascade Reserve, a blind bear would continue his solitary existence, living proof that the mind's eye could see far more than the physical eye ever could. The story of Kodiak was not a fairy tale with a perfect ending. It was something more meaningful, a true account of how catastrophe could be transformed into transcendence, how an individual animal could reshape human consciousness, and how the natural world still held mysteries that science was only beginning to understand. And perhaps most importantly, it was a story about seeing, about the infinite ways of perceiving the world, and how sometimes the greatest revelations come not from light, but from the darkness we learn to navigate with courage, intelligence, and an open heart. The bear in the Cascade Reserve continued his walks through the forest, moving with perfect grace and certainty, a living reminder that consciousness is far more wondrous and complex than we ever dared to imagine.